I was just Kentucky. I was just absolutely amazed at how widespread this become. I am just so thrilled, and I thank all of you for participating. What we're going to do, we're going to be talking about the circus in Peru. So if all of you will open your American history books, chapter 14.
Sure we will.
Sure. All right. The history of Peru is a long and various course. It starts back in the 1880s with a man by the name of Ben Wallace, who at this point in time was a grown man. When he came to Miami County as a young child with his family, he soon lost his father to malaria. In the course of that, we don't know where exactly his mother ended up, but he lost his brothers and sisters to malaria as well. As a grown man, he got married and lost his first wife to malaria. This was a man that knew defeat over and over and over, but yet he refused to quit. And I will be honored to say that I worked with a young man this week, Jaden Worley, who did the same thing that Ben Wallace did. He worked his tail off, and he did not know what the word stop was. He was a true asset to the Circus Hall of Fame. Ben Wallace started out with a livery stable. He made a living selling and trading horses, renting them out, and made his living right in downtown Peru as we know it today. In the 1880s, he got it in his head that a circus would be a really cool thing to have. And he found a bankrupt circus and he bought it. And he put it into a warehouse which had a lot of animals. And if anybody knows anything about animals, you have to have hay and you have to have sawdust. And if you know anything about hay and sawdust, you know it's combustible. And sure enough, he lost everything that he owned in a fire shortly after he bought it. Oh, God. But that didn't stop him. He found another bankrupt circus. And he turned around and he bought it. And that was in like the winter. And by April, he took his first circus on the road. And at this point in time, my eyes don't work anymore. There we go.
It's parked in front
All
of the
right.
South Door.
He was a businessman from one end to the other, but he also learned the trade of grift, and that is the 3-card monte and the balls under the cups and different things that happened to make a little side money, as the circus would say, that kept them going, but didn't leave them a very good reputation at times. But he continued to grow, and in 2 years, he turned around and he took his little wagon circus that he had and put it on rails. And he left the state of Indiana and Illinois, and he started touring as many as 7 and 8 and 9 different states in a season. His circus grew and grew and grew to the point that by 1907, he bought another circus that had just gone out of business called the Carl Hagenbeck Wild Animal Train Circus. With this, he picked up the name Hagenbeck, and it became the Hagenbeck-Wallace Circus. The Wallace and Company's Great World Menagerie, Grand International Mardi Gras, Highway Holiday Adagio, and Alliance of Novelties was the first title of his circus. Well, you can imagine that you can't remember that, and none of his customers could either. And so by the very next year, it was simply called Wallace and Company. He learned the art of advertising real fast. By 1890, he had grown his show to 28 railroad cars, and he was actually leasing one elephant. By 1891, he bought 2 more elephants and was leasing 1 elephant. And by 1892, he bought another elephant, leasing 2 elephants. In 1892, he changed the show title to Cook and Whitby because the grift I was telling you about was catching up to his show title of Wallace and Company. So let's change the name and nobody will know it's us. But as it turned out, the elephants was going to be one of the big things that he enjoyed the most. And he got to the point where he bought elephants and he turned around and leased them to other circuses himself. So not only did he have his elephants, he had elephants leased to as many as 4 different circuses at the same time. In 1899, he purchased the J.H. LaPearl Circus. He expanded what he had into a circus that had wagons that were made by the Studebaker Company. Anybody heard of Studebaker before? How many of you knew they made horse-drawn wagons before they ever made a car? He had a bunch of wagons made by the Studebaker Company. And by 1901, he was actually moving on 50 rail cars. Now, to give you a proportional idea, he is now competing head-to-head with the Ringling Brothers, World's Greatest Circus, the Barnum and Bailey, Greatest Show on Earth, and the Adam Forepaugh and Sells Brothers Circus. He is definitely the 4th largest circus in the world at this point. In 1906, he ended up buying the Carl Hagenbeck Circus, making him the 3rd largest circus because Adam Forepaugh and Sells Brothers wasn't on the road anymore. And the Hagenbeck Wallace Circus is now born. Now, with the aid of computerization, I have been able to take several of the black and white photos that we know exist and put a little life in them. And so this is what the Ben Wallace Winterquarters looked like when you walked in. The big barn to the left that has the elephant on it was his elephant barn. He built it, and his elephants immediately tore it down that winter. And so he ended up rebuilding it again. Along about 1904, a couple of young men, and I do mean young, these gentlemen were like 17 and 18 years old. One of them was named Jeremiah Muggovan, and the other one was Albert Bowers. Albert is well known as Bert Bowers. They entered the circus ownership where they had been working for circuses for a couple of years as young men, learning the business, not realizing that they were really learning how to operate a business. But they bought the Van Amberg's Trained Animal Circus for $3,000. That's a sizable chunk of money back in 1904. And if anybody knows anything about the circus in the early days, it was formed around the nucleus of the horse. The horse was the thing that everybody wanted to see, and every farmer had a horse or 2 or 4. But those horses paled in comparison to the quality of horses that were on the circus. And that is what the circus prided itself on, was its horsemanship. Jerry Muggovan and Bert Bowers operated the Van Amberg Trained Animal Circus from 1904 to 1907. I point this out because they are going to become a huge part of the history later on. They changed the title to Howe's Great London Shows in 1908, ran it through 1916, and in 1911, they also bought another circus called the Dode Fisk Circus. They took it out as Sanger's Circus, which was a British name well known for animals, and it stayed on the road through 1913. In 1916, they went to the John Robinson family in Cincinnati, Ohio, and made a deal to buy the John Robinson Circus. They didn't want the circus. They didn't care about the circus, but the John Robinson name was renowned. And they wanted the John Robinson name to travel in the South. They had always traveled in the Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. That was their market, and everybody knew who John Robinson was. To tell you how they did not want the circus, 3 days after they bought it, they sold it all to someone else, who turned around and sold most of it to Ben Wallace. And most of the John Robinson Circus ended up here in Peru. By 1913, many of you have already heard about the horrible floods that hit Peru. The floods were so bad that he lost many of his animals. All his caged animals that couldn't be released were all lost. He lost several of his elephants. His horses were better off because they could run loose and get into higher pastures. It's the flood of the century, as they say, and it's never occurred since. But at that time, it destroyed him. But it didn't knock him down, because he turned around and he started leasing animals from other people, and he opened his season on his regularly scheduled day in April. He went on, and in the middle of June, he finally said, you know, I did everything I could. I've got it on the road. We're making money. It's time for me to quit. So he turned around, he put the circus up for sale in June of 1913 while it was making money, and it was an attractive investment for someone else. And that investment person that came along was a man by the name of Ed Ballard. Many of you know he is related with the French Lick, West Baden hotels and casinos. He was smart enough to bring in some people that he knew, like O.E. Corey and John Talbert, and J.B. Warren, and Charles Hageman. They all filed a corporation for the Carl Hagenbeck and Great Wallace Shows Company, and they immediately took over the entire circus. This poor fella, well, actually it's a girl, but she ended up floating in all the floods into downtown Peru, which all of you know from driving out here was 3 miles that way, where she was later found dead alongside one of the houses when the water receded. In 1918, this becomes a huge year for the Muggavan and Bowers conglomeration, because Ed Ballard and his company suffered the worst train wreck that they could ever imagine up near Chicago, when a military train ran into the back end and killed 168 people on the show, and they are all buried in what they call Showman's Rest Cemetery up there now. With that, they ended up having all kinds of lawsuits. The family members were trying to recover family monies, take care of the people that were destroyed, and so they ended up going bankrupt and turned around and put the circus up for sale. With the sale, there was only 2 bids put in. Jerry Muggavan and Bert Bowers bought the entire Hagenbeck Wallace Circus for $36,100. The Ringling Brothers were outbid. That the Winterquarters is out. And that land was farmed because you now have all these horses, all these elephants, camels, zebras, giraffes, anything that eats hay needs to be fed. So they raised their own feed. They raised so much feed that they sold what they could and made a profit to keep them going throughout the winter when most other shows have no income. By 1920, the Howe's Great London Shows is regrouped and put back on the road as a 15-car circus. Why is that important? Because that's the first circus that left. John Robinson turned out and went out again. The Howe's Great London came back to Lancaster, Missouri, which was the home of William P. Hall, and he was a circus broker. So they turned around and went into his Winterquarters for the winter, where they could buy more animals, change their horses, get new wagons, and really rebuild their entire circus into a much better quality circus. The Hagenbeck Wallace Circus went to West Baden, Indiana, and this property stayed empty. Unfortunately, in 1921, Ben Wallace is going to pass away, and his legacy is gone, and his family gets rid of the estate immediately. And Muggavan and Bowers are smart enough to ask Ed Ballard, who had tons of money but didn't want to be in the circus business anymore, to become their partner. And they incorporated what is called the American Circus Corporation. Interestingly, it was incorporated in the state of Delaware because that was the least amount of taxable income that anybody could get away with. The American Circus Corporation turned out to be the largest circus corporation in America. It was larger than the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, which was now combined, and had moved to Florida just recently after living in Bridgeport, Connecticut for a couple years. They bought the train sheds, which were 5 miles north of here. The property the Winterquarters is on, plus the 600 acres of farmland around here for $500,000. Still quite a bargain at that day. By 1922, things were changing again. The John Robinson Circus returned to the Ben Wallace Winterquarters here, and they turned around and bought a circus called the Sells Floto Circus that was wintered in Denver, Colorado, of all places. In 1922, and that is what we're celebrating this year as the 100th anniversary, this Winterquarters started to rebuild. And they utilized some of the buildings that were here from Ben Wallace and turned around and built all their own buildings. This is one of them. The Elephant Barn is another one. The wagon shed back here is a third one. The corn crib that has fallen apart up front, and the office at the front are the 5 remaining buildings from that 1922 build. They are all listed on the National Historic Landmark Registry now. This building is 150 feet long, it is 70 feet wide, and then you have 2 15-foot wings as you walk through. Above you is a second floor, which takes you to 40 feet in the air to the peak of the roof. The upstairs of this particular building, if you walk out on the front, you can see there's an overhang. There was a pulley on there, and that was the canvas loft upstairs. They would open those large doors. They would hook the bales of canvas from the tents to a rope, and that rope was hooked to an elephant who simply went for a stroll and pulled the canvas up to the top where people muscled the canvas inside. They would work on that canvas all winter long, whether it was repairing a tent, sewing a rip, actually making something new, but that's what they did. There's a set of stairs right here. This was done as a fire escape because obviously if you're upstairs and there's a fire and you have no way to get out, you're in trouble. So there was actually a set of stairs right above my head on this back wall that went down this way, and that set of stairs. Now, the problem with that is you do not enter into this building if you don't work here. This was a very, very strict class type system. So if you worked in the horse department, you were not allowed in the elephant barn. If you worked in the elephant barn, you're not allowed in the wagon shop. And so everybody had their separate places to be, and everybody respected everybody else's place to be. Now, the way this worked, they would have what they called the rodeo days, where it was open to the public. They wanted people to come out and see what's going on out here. It provided a little bit of money coming in. At the very end of the main road is our little house that we call the gatehouse. It was the office for the American Circus Corporation, and it was the grand central station of all things that could happen with the circus. This is where the railroad contracts were made. This is where the performers were hired. This is where regular workers were hired. This is where the days were filled in for the routes. This is where all the information was made to get bread at the next stand. Or we need meat here, or we need this. They did everything except the mail. They had to go in town to get the mail and bring it back to the people that were here. So what they did was the public would walk in the front door, which is boarded up right now, but you can see the concrete steps out there. They paid their admission. They came through the porch, came out the back steps, and this is the first thing they saw when they walked out the back steps. There was a training ring, which is on your right, and the elephant barn, which is still standing right now on your left, and several of the buildings in the back that are no longer there. By 1923, most of the expansion had already begun to the point that some of these buildings were already usable. The building construction continued through 1925. It took a couple years off and they built some more buildings in 1929. The circus had become a huge, huge instrument in Miami County in Peru, to the point that people were now coming to the American Circus Corporation to buy stuff. T.A. Wolfe, who owned a carnival, actually came to buy wagons for his carnival because the wagons here were in better condition than what he had. The Mighty Sheasley Shows was another carnival. They also bought wagons and flat cars from the circus because the circus had duplicates of so many things after they had bought this circus, bought that circus, bought this circus. They were literally taking the best of what they wanted and everything else was surplus. Now, the one story I failed to tell you at the time, and some of you have already heard this, but Ben Wallace was known for sending all his money home to the bank as they traveled. He turned around, he started sending it home in nail kegs. So it said, 10 penny nails, 16 penny nails, whatever. Nobody thought anything about it. But the bank, after several years of counting all those coins, said, enough is enough. That's a lot of coins. We're just spending some. He said, no problem. I can fix that. And he turned around and opened his own bank. It was called the Wabash Valley and Trust. It operated for 75 years, and it stood right where the CVS is in town now. Since it was his bank, he used it the way he wanted to. So he moved all his wardrobe department to the third floor of the building, where they made costumes and worked on all the blankets for the animals all winter long. And they didn't have to be out here. Well, in June of 1924, because Ben Wallace has already passed away, Jerry Mugovan became the president of the bank. And he controlled it until 1929 when he passed away. Now, if you're going to have a circus, you're going to love to have elephants. And the American Circus Corporation had as many as 50 elephants at one time. Now, because they had that many, they couldn't all be in this barn behind us. So as you go in town and you get to the hairpin turn on the curve, there's another couple old barns, and that was referred to as the Ballard Farm. And a lot of the elephants were kept down there as well. That is also where they kept, it was called, we found 3 different sets of gates so far that was on that property, where it was called the Springdale Farms. But across the street is cornfields again, and they also used that like sales, auctions, when they needed a tent and they had large crowds. That's where they would set it up for everybody. Now, in 1928, there was speculation that the circus might be moving because the Ringling Circus had just moved to Florida. And so there was a question as to whether they were really going to stay here or not. They kicked it around. They decided, yeah, we've got too much invested here, let's stay. So they turned around, they started another section of buildings, which was way down this end where the farmers' sheds are now. And they put up a huge, huge horse barn with 2 round rings, training ring barns, a huge wagon shed, and a huge hay shed. In 1930, because they put the hay up too early and it was too wet, spontaneous combustion decided to take down those barns. So they didn't even use them for a year. But they did turn around and continue their growth. And they bought 2 circuses that were major enterprises. One was on the West Coast called the Algae Barn Circus. And the other one was based out of Alabama and Georgia, and it was called the Sparks Circus. They now had 5 circuses traveling across the country. Now, you remember that building I was telling you about back there that was doing all that contractual work? Just multiply that times 5. Those people couldn't see straight after a day's work of filling out forms and making phone calls and signing contracts. But the crazy way this works, in 1929, the American Circus Corporation had weaseled away into Madison Square Garden. And this is where the Ringling Circus had opened every year for gosh knows how many years. John Ringling went livid. He could not believe that the Ringling Circus was not going to open in Madison Square Garden. So he called Jerry Mugovan, and he said, I want you to come out here. We're going to talk about buying your circus. Jerry Mugovan told him, I'm not going anywhere. If you want to buy it, come out here. And so they did. They spoke for several days, And the stories can't be confirmed, I understand that. But the stories basically say it boiled down to a coin flip. And John Ringling ended up buying the American Circus Corporation, everything they owned, all the land, all the circus titles, and the equipment for under $2 million. I think I've read like $1.8 million. 6 weeks later, the New York Stock Exchange crashed. And John Ringling now had a huge payment over his head that he could not pay. He did everything he could to not lose his Ringling Circus to start with. So now he's controlling 6 circuses himself. Unfortunately for Jerry Mugovan, it turned out to be the best thing in the world because he went in for a simple hernia surgery the next year and died in the hospital. So his empire crashed. Fortunately, he was smart enough to get out of it first. So this gives you a ballpark idea of what the Winterquarters looked like in 1929. There was 42 buildings on this property. There was everything from a company store to a commissary, a hospital. There was like a billiards and pool table recreation area for the workers. There was a barber shop. There was housing. The actual home that's right beside us was the cookhouse at that time. And the people that lived upstairs were your higher end management. There were buildings for horses from one end to the other. There was dormitory type bunks where there was 3 high and just enough room to squeeze between them. There was a steam room attached to that dormitory room that actually heated all these buildings with steam. There was a small building out by the front that was called the pump house, and they had an electric pump that pumped water out of the river to feed all the fire hydrants that you see on the property. Unfortunately, every time a fire broke out and they got the pump started, the fire was already fully involved. And so all they were doing was just spraying water on something they couldn't control. Now, this is one of the things, I colorized this using Adobe Photoshop, but this is simply based on one description we found in a magazine called Billboard that said the old wooden fence out there was bright yellow with bright red letters. So this gives you a pretty good idea what it looked like. The 2 buildings in the back were the huge horse barns. They were 200 feet long, just like this with the wings, and they could house as many horses as they could squeeze in there. The horses that they kept in there were what you call your ring stock and your menagerie or your menage horses, the ones that really performed in the shows. The baggage stock were all turned out to pasture all winter long. Now, the circus is also well known for having celebrities, whether it's Tom Mix, Hopalong Cassidy, Joe Louis, the boxer. They've all turned to celebrities at one time or another to help promote their circus. And so Tom Mix was no different. He traveled with the Sells Florida Circus for 4 different years. And along comes some people that made their living and made their lives and made their homes right here in Peru. And one of those gentlemen was a man by the name of Clyde Beatty. And his granddaughters and great-granddaughters still live in this town. Emmett Kelly lived here for years. The Hajini family lived here for years. The great Wilno lived here for years. And many of those people became the initial coaches to the Peru Youth Circus. So even though they were finally retired from the circus, they took their skills that they used for a living and showed the kids growing up how to become a circus performer. And now some of those circus performers are now 2nd and 3rd generation trainers for the Peru Youth Circus now. So it's a long family heritage that has continued to grow in Peru.